There is a specific and measurable moment at which good decision-making tends to collapse, and it is not the moment when the stakes become highest. It is the moment when the amount of unknown information exceeds a certain threshold, when a person can no longer construct even a rough mental model of what outcomes are likely, what probabilities attach to which possibilities, or what the relevant range of scenarios even includes. Human beings, it turns out, are reasonably good at making decisions under risk, situations in which the possible outcomes are known and can be assigned at least approximate probabilities. Human beings are considerably worse, and worse in specific, predictable, and well-documented ways, at making decisions under genuine uncertainty, situations in which even the basic structure of what might happen remains substantially unknown. This distinction between risk and uncertainty was first drawn with theoretical precision by the economist Frank Knight in his influential 1921 book Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, and it has become one of the foundational distinctions in the modern scientific understanding of human decision-making. Knight proposed that risk describes situations in which the probability distribution of possible outcomes is knowable, even if the specific outcome in any given instance is not, the kind of situation a casino or an insurance company operates within. Uncertainty, by contrast, describes situations in which even the probability distribution itself is unknown or unknowable, situations in which a person cannot say with any confidence not just what will happen, but what the space of things that might happen even looks like. Understanding what happens to human cognition and decision-making, specifically under conditions of this second, more severe category, genuine uncertainty rather than merely quantifiable risk, has become one of the most practically important and most extensively researched areas in behavioral science, spanning everything from financial crisis behavior to medical decision-making to the psychology of major life transitions. Let's begin with the foundational experimental work that first demonstrated how differently the human mind processes these two categories of unknown. The economist Daniel Ellsberg, before he became famous for an entirely different reason involving the Pentagon Papers, conducted a landmark series of experiments in 1961 that have become known as the Ellsberg paradox, demonstrating that human beings show a strong and systematic preference for known probabilities over unknown probabilities, even when this preference produces choices that violate the basic axioms of rational decision theory. In Ellsberg's classic experimental paradigm, participants were shown two urns, one containing a known 50-50 mixture of red and black balls, and another containing an unknown mixture of red and black balls in unspecified proportions, and asked to bet on drawing a particular color from a particular urn. Ellsberg found that participants overwhelmingly preferred betting on the known urn, regardless of which color they were betting on, a pattern that violates rational choice theory, because if a person prefers betting on red from the known urn to betting on red from the unknown urn, and also prefers betting on black from the known urn to betting on black from the unknown urn, they are implicitly behaving as though the known urn offers better odds for both colors simultaneously, a logical impossibility. This finding, subsequently replicated in hundreds of studies across dramatically different populations and contexts, demonstrated that human beings possess what researchers now call ambiguity aversion, a specific and measurable aversion to genuine uncertainty that is distinct from and operates independently of ordinary risk aversion. The neuroscientist Ming, working with Colin, Camerer, whose ultimatum game research we examined in an earlier video in this series, conducted brain imaging research documenting that decisions involving genuine ambiguity, as opposed to decisions involving quantified risk, engage a distinct neural signature, showing significantly greater activation in the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex, regions associated with the processing of negative emotional states and the evaluation of uncertain or potentially threatening outcomes, compared to decisions involving equivalent objective levels of risk with known probabilities. This finding provides a specific neurobiological account of why genuine uncertainty produces such a distinctively aversive psychological experience compared to merely risky decisions with identical expected value. The brain appears to process the two categories of unknown through substantially different neural systems, with ambiguity specifically engaging circuitry associated with threat and negative affect to a degree that quantified risk, even at an equivalent objective level of danger, does not. The psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development has developed an influential and somewhat contrarian account of how human decision-making actually functions under conditions of genuine uncertainty, challenging the widespread assumption within behavioral economics that departures from strict rational choice theory under uncertainty necessarily represent cognitive errors or biases to be corrected. Gigerenzer's research on what he calls fast and frugal heuristics has documented that under conditions of genuine uncertainty, where the complex probabilistic calculations required by formal rational choice models are not actually computable given the available information, simple heuristic decision rules frequently outperform more sophisticated statistical models, precisely because these heuristics do not require the kind of complete and accurate information about underlying probability distributions that formal models assume, but that genuine uncertainty, by definition, does not provide. Gigerenzer's research on what he calls the recognition heuristic, in which decision-makers under uncertainty rely on the simple binary judgment of whether an option is recognized or unrecognized, rather than attempting more complex evaluation, has documented that this simple heuristic frequently produces decisions of comparable or superior quality to more sophisticated analytical approaches, specifically in domains characterized by genuine uncertainty, including certain categories of financial and medical decision-making. Though Gigerenzer's research also carefully documents the specific structural conditions under which simple heuristics outperform complex models, and the conditions under which the reverse holds true, avoiding the simplistic conclusion that heuristics are always superior to formal analysis. The specific psychological and physiological effects of prolonged exposure to genuine uncertainty, as opposed to the effects of a single uncertain decision examined in isolation, have been documented extensively by the neuroscientist Sarah Bengtsson and colleagues, whose research has found that chronic exposure to unpredictable and uncontrollable circumstances produces a specific pattern of stress physiology distinct from the physiological response to predictable, even if severe, stressors. This research has found that unpredictability itself, independent of the objective severity of the underlying threat or challenge, functions as a specific and independently potent psychological stressor, activating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and producing elevated and sustained cortisol release in a manner that predictable stressors of equivalent or even greater objective severity do not produce to the same degree. This research connects to the influential concept of learned helplessness, first documented by the psychologist Martin Seligman in a series of experiments demonstrating that organisms exposed to genuinely uncontrollable and unpredictable negative events develop a specific and measurable deficit in subsequent motivation and problem-solving behavior, even when subsequently placed in situations where effective action would actually be possible, a deficit substantially more severe and more persistent than the effects produced by exposure to negative events that, while still aversive, were at least predictable or controllable to some degree. Seligman's foundational research and the substantial body of subsequent work it generated have established that the specific psychological damage produced by uncertainty is not simply a function of the objective negative outcomes uncertainty may produce, but reflects something more fundamental about the specific cognitive and motivational cost of operating within an environment that cannot be modeled or predicted with any confidence. The psychologist Jacob Hirsh at the University of Toronto has proposed an integrative theoretical framework, drawing on the broader neuroscience of uncertainty processing, suggesting that the human aversion to uncertainty reflects the operation of what he calls the entropy disruption model, proposing that psychological distress under uncertainty tracks the specific degree to which available information fails to constrain the space of possible future states, a formalization that helps explain why uncertainty produces distress even in situations where the objective probability of a negative outcome is quite low, because it is specifically the unconstrained, unmodeled character of the possibility space itself, rather than the calculated probability of any specific bad outcome within that space, that the human threat detection system appears calibrated to respond to. This theoretical account has significant practical implications for understanding a consistent finding across multiple applied domains of decision research, that providing people with structured information about the range and likely distribution of possible outcomes, even when this information cannot eliminate genuine underlying uncertainty, and even when it does not change the objective probability of negative outcomes, measurably reduces psychological distress and improves decision quality, apparently by converting at least some portion of genuine unstructured uncertainty into the more psychologically manageable category of quantified risk. even when this conversion is necessarily somewhat artificial, given that the true underlying uncertainty has not actually been resolved. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention, because it addresses a specific and counterintuitive finding regarding individual differences in how people respond to genuine uncertainty, one that complicates any simple story in which uncertainty aversion is a uniform human response to be managed or minimized. The psychologist Jordan Peterson and the neuroscientist colleague Colin in research examining the personality trait dimension of openness to experience, one of the 5 major dimensions in the widely validated Big Five model of human personality, have documented that individuals scoring higher on this trait show measurably different neural and behavioral responses to ambiguous and uncertain stimuli, compared to individuals scoring lower, including reduced amygdala reactivity to ambiguous threat cues, and a correspondingly greater tendency to approach rather than avoid situations characterized by genuine uncertainty. This research suggests that the aversion to uncertainty documented by Ellsberg and subsequent researchers, while a robust average tendency across the human population, is not a fixed or uniform feature of human cognition, but shows substantial and psychologically meaningful individual variation, connected to broader and independently well-validated dimensions of human personality. This individual variation has significant practical implications that have been explored by the psychologist Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania, whose broader research on grit and sustained goal pursuit under difficult conditions has found that individuals who maintain effective functioning and sustained effort, specifically under conditions of prolonged uncertainty, rather than simply tolerating brief uncertain episodes, show a distinctive psychological profile characterized not by lower baseline uncertainty aversion, but by a specific and trainable capacity to maintain commitment to long-term goals, despite the inability to clearly forecast the specific path by which those goals will be achieved. A capacity Duckworth's research suggests can be measurably strengthened through deliberate practice and structured experience with manageable uncertainty, rather than being simply a fixed trait some individuals possess and others lack entirely. The organizational psychologist Karl Weick, whose extensive research on how organizations and teams function effectively under conditions of extreme and consequential uncertainty, including his influential studies of wildland firefighting crews and their decision-making processes during rapidly evolving and highly unpredictable fire conditions, has documented that the specific organizational and individual practices that predict effective functioning under genuine uncertainty differ substantially from the practices that predict effective functioning under quantifiable risk. Weick's research found that successful navigation of genuine uncertainty depends less on accurate prediction, which the fundamental unsolvability of the underlying informational problem makes impossible by definition, and more on what he calls sensemaking, the ongoing, iterative process of constructing provisional, continuously revised interpretations of an evolving situation that are good enough to guide immediate action, even though they cannot be confirmed as accurate in advance, and must be continuously updated as new information becomes available. Weick's research on high-reliability organizations, teams, and institutions that maintain safe and effective functioning despite operating in environments characterized by irreducible uncertainty, including nuclear power plant operations, aircraft carrier flight deck operations, and emergency medical response, has identified specific organizational practices, including what he calls a preoccupation with failure, actively maintaining sensitivity to weak signals that a provisional understanding of the situation may be incorrect, and a reluctance to simplify interpretations prematurely, that collectively allow these organizations to function effectively despite operating continuously within conditions of genuine, irreducible uncertainty rather than merely quantifiable risk. The economist John Giannakopoulos and the broader field of behavioral finance have documented the specific and often severely costly consequences of ambiguity aversion and uncertainty-driven decision degradation in financial markets. Specifically, finding that periods of genuine market uncertainty, as opposed to periods of merely elevated but quantifiable risk, produce distinctive and well-documented patterns of investor behavior, including excessive selling, a pronounced flight toward assets perceived as certain, regardless of their actual risk-adjusted return characteristics, and a measurable degradation in the quality of financial decision-making that closely parallels the broader psychological research on uncertainty-driven cognitive impairment. There is one further dimension of this research worth examining, because it addresses the specific developmental question of how the capacity to tolerate and function effectively under genuine uncertainty changes across the human lifespan, and what factors during childhood and adolescence appear to shape this capacity in adulthood. The developmental psychologist Nathan Fox at the University of Maryland has conducted extensive longitudinal research examining the developmental origins of what he calls intolerance of uncertainty, a measurable individual difference dimension distinct from general anxiety that specifically captures the degree to which a person experiences ambiguous or unpredictable situations as inherently distressing, regardless of the objective probability of a negative outcome. Fox's research has found that early childhood temperament, specifically a pattern he calls behavioral inhibition, characterized by heightened physiological and behavioral reactivity to novel and unfamiliar stimuli in infancy and early childhood, substantially predicts elevated intolerance of uncertainty in adulthood, though Fox's research has also documented that this developmental trajectory is not fixed, and that specific patterns of parental response to early childhood uncertainty, particularly parenting that provides graduated and supported exposure to manageable uncertainty, rather than either overprotection that eliminates uncertain experiences entirely or unsupported exposure that overwhelms a child's coping capacity, predicts meaningfully better adult outcomes on measures of uncertainty tolerance even among children who showed the highly reactive behavioral inhibition temperament pattern in infancy. This developmental research connects to a broader body of work on what psychologists call stress inoculation. The finding, established across multiple research programs, including work by the psychologist Mark Seery at the University at Buffalo, that moderate and manageable exposure to adversity and uncertainty during development, as opposed to either the complete absence of such exposure or exposure to overwhelming and unmanageable adversity, predicts superior psychological resilience and uncertainty tolerance in adulthood, producing what Seery's research describes as a specific inverted U-shaped relationship between lifetime adversity exposure and adult psychological resilience, in which individuals with a moderate history of manageable adversity and uncertainty show measurably better subsequent functioning under novel uncertain conditions than individuals with either extremely low or extremely high levels of prior adverse and uncertain experience. Seery's research proposes that this pattern reflects a genuine developmental calibration process, in which the human nervous system's capacity to tolerate and effectively function under uncertainty is not simply a fixed trait present from birth, but is substantially shaped through accumulated experience with manageable uncertainty across development, a finding with significant practical implications for understanding both individual differences in adult uncertainty tolerance and the potential value of deliberately structured exposure to manageable uncertainty, as opposed to either uncertainty avoidance or unstructured overwhelming uncertainty, as a means of building this capacity across the human lifespan. What emerges from this substantial body of research is a picture of human decision-making as a system that is reasonably well calibrated to handle risk, situations involving quantifiable probability, but that responds to genuine uncertainty through a distinct and evolutionarily older threat response system, one that produces measurable psychological distress, physiological stress activation, and systematic departures from formally rational decision-making, not because human cognition is simply defective under these conditions, but because the underlying computational problem that genuine uncertainty presents, constructing a reliable model of possibility from fundamentally insufficient information, may not actually be solvable through the kind of careful, deliberative calculation that works well under conditions of merely quantifiable risk. The paralysis you may have felt facing a decision where you could not even confidently list the possible outcomes, let alone assign them probabilities, was not a failure of your reasoning. It was your evolved decision-making system correctly recognizing that it had encountered a fundamentally different category of problem than the one it evolved to solve, a problem in which the ordinary tools of careful deliberation, weighing known probabilities against known values, simply do not have sufficient raw material to operate on. Genuine uncertainty does not call for better calculation. It calls for a different kind of response entirely, one built less around solving the unsolvable problem of what specifically will happen, and more around building the kind of resilience, flexibility, and capacity to act despite incomplete information that allowed your ancestors to survive in a world that, for the entire span of human evolutionary history, never once offered them anything resembling the comfortable, quantified probabilities of a casino game. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.